The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when a young waitress finished her night shift at the local diner. Her muscles ached from hours of carrying heavy plates and managing the late-night rush, but she couldn't complain. Every dollar earned brought her closer to her dream of attending nursing school. The crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks as she walked through the quiet streets of her small town, her worn sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk. As she approached the intersection near the town square, an unusual sound caught her attention, a mixture of metal scraping against concrete and what seemed like a faint cry for help. Her heart quickened as she rounded the corner, and the scene before her made her blood run cold. A car had somehow veered off the road and partially mounted the curb, its front end crushed against a building. But what truly horrified her was the sight of an elderly woman trapped underneath the vehicle. Without hesitation, the young waitress dropped her bag and rushed forward. Her hands trembled as she assessed the situation, her mind racing through the basic first aid training she'd received during her brief stint as a summer camp counselor. The elderly woman was conscious but clearly in distress, her silver hair matted against her forehead, her glasses askew on her face. "Hold on, ma'am," the waitress called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm going to get you out of there." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed emergency services, quickly explaining the situation. But as she looked at the trapped woman's increasingly pale face, she knew waiting wasn't an option. Years of carrying heavy trays and moving furniture had built up her strength, but what happened next surprised even her. As adrenaline coursed through her veins, she positioned herself at the car's front end. The metal felt cold against her palms as she planted her feet firmly on the ground. With every ounce of strength she possessed, she began to lift. The car didn't budge at first, and panic threatened to overwhelm her. The elderly woman's breathing was becoming more labored, and each second felt like an eternity. Then, something remarkable happened. A newspaper delivery person noticed the commotion and rushed to help. Together, they managed to lift the vehicle just enough to create a small gap. "Can you move, ma'am?" the waitress asked, her arms shaking from the strain. The elderly woman slowly began to drag herself forward, wincing with each movement. Just as she cleared the vehicle's underside, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The paramedics arrived moments later, quickly taking charge of the situation. As they attended to the elderly woman, the waitress stood back, her uniform covered in dirt and grease, her hands still trembling from the experience. She watched as they carefully loaded the woman into the ambulance, their efficient movements a dance she hoped to master herself one day. Little did she know, this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would completely transform her life. As she gave her statement to the police, she had no idea that the woman she just saved was someone whose influence would reach far beyond this early morning rescue. The newspaper delivery person patted her shoulder before leaving, saying something about her being a hero, but she barely heard the words. All she could think about was the determined look in the elderly woman's eyes as she fought to free herself, a look that would stay with her for years to come. The next few days passed in a blur of regular shifts and sleepless nights. The young waitress couldn't shake the image of the accident from her mind, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the elderly woman's face. She went through her usual routine at the diner, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and offering warm smiles to tired truckers, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that morning. On Wednesday afternoon, just as she was about to start her shift, the diner's bell chimed. A well-dressed man in his 40s walked in, his polished shoes and crisp suit standing out among the usual crowd of factory workers and local shopkeepers. He scanned the room before his eyes settled on her, and something about his purposeful stride made her stomach tighten with anticipation. "Are you the young lady who helped rescue Mrs. Chen from under the car on Monday morning?" he asked, his voice gentle but commanding. When she nodded, his face broke into a warm smile. "I'm her son, and I've been looking for you. Mom's been asking about you non-stop since she regained consciousness." Relief flooded through her, the elderly woman was alive and awake. She'd been too afraid to visit the hospital, worried about intruding on a family's private moments of crisis. The man, Mr. Chen, insisted on buying her a cup of coffee, and as they sat in a quiet booth, he shared his mother's story. Mrs. Chen, it turned out, wasn't just any elderly woman. She was the founder of one of the largest charitable foundations in the region, dedicated to providing educational opportunities to hardworking students who couldn't afford college. Despite her age and accomplishments, she still insisted on taking early morning walks to stay connected with the community she served. The doctor said if you hadn't acted when you did. Mr. Chen's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and continued, Mom wants to meet you properly. She says she remembers your voice, how you kept talking to her, keeping her calm while you both waited for help. The waitress felt her cheeks warm at the memory. She'd rambled about everything and nothing, her dreams of becoming a nurse, her struggle to save enough for school, even her grandmother's secret recipe for chicken soup. She hadn't known if Mrs. Chen could hear her, but she'd needed to fill the terrible silence while they waited for the ambulance. Would you be willing to visit her? Mr. Chen asked, pulling out a business card. She's being discharged tomorrow, but she'd love to thank you in person at our home this weekend. And he hesitated, a mysterious smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She says she has something important to discuss with you. As Mr. Chen left the diner, the waitress held his business card in her trembling hands. The elegant silver lettering caught the afternoon sunlight, Chen Family Foundation, empowering dreams through education. Her mind raced with possibilities, but she quickly pushed them aside. She'd helped Mrs. Chen because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected anything in return. Still, as she tied her apron and prepared for her shift, she couldn't help but feel that something extraordinary was about to happen. The other waitresses noticed her distraction, the way she kept touching the business card in her pocket as if to make sure it was real. Her manager even asked if she was feeling all right when she accidentally poured orange juice instead of coffee into a customer's cup. That night, as she lay in bed in her tiny studio apartment, surrounded by textbooks she'd borrowed from the library and nursing school brochures she couldn't afford to pursue, she allowed herself to dream. Not of recognition or reward, but of the chance to thank Mrs. Chen in return, for surviving, for being strong, for giving her a moment of clarity that proved she was meant to help others. Saturday morning arrived with a mixture of sunshine and nervous energy. The waitress stood before her modest closet, trying to decide what to wear to meet Mrs. Chen. After changing outfits 3 times, she settled on her nicest blouse, the one she saved for job interviews, and a simple pair of dark pants. Her hands shook slightly as she pinned back her hair, her stomach doing flips as she thought about the upcoming visit. The address on Mr. Chen's business card led her to a part of town she rarely visited. As she stepped off the bus, she found herself in a neighborhood where elegant houses sat back from tree-lined streets. Following the GPS on her phone, she walked past manicured lawns and carefully tended gardens, feeling increasingly out of place with each step. The Chen family home wasn't the largest on the street, but it had a gentle grace about it. Flowering cherry trees lined the driveway, their pink blossoms creating a soft carpet on the ground. As she approached the front door, she noticed small details that spoke of Mrs. Chen's character: a little free library box by the sidewalk, a bench with a welcome sign in multiple languages, and a wheelchair ramp recently added to the front steps. Before she could ring the doorbell, the door swung open. Mr. Chen greeted her with a warm smile, but it was the familiar voice calling from inside that made her heart skip a beat. Is that her? Please, bring her to the sunroom. Mrs. Chen's voice was stronger than it had been during their first encounter, filled with an enthusiasm that put the waitress instantly at ease. The sunroom was a peaceful space filled with plants and natural light. Mrs. Chen sat in a comfortable chair, her leg elevated and wrapped in a cast, but her eyes bright and alert. The moment she saw the waitress, she extended both arms in welcome. My guardian angel. Come sit with me. My son has told me you prefer jasmine tea. I had some brought in specially. The waitress felt tears prick at her eyes as she took in Mrs. Chen's recovering form. The frightened, pale woman from under the car had been replaced by someone radiating warmth and vitality. They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. Mrs. Chen insisted on hearing about the waitress's family, her work at the diner, and especially her dreams of becoming a nurse. You know, Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, stirring her tea, when I was trapped under that car, I wasn't thinking about my foundation or my achievements. I was thinking about all the things I still wanted to do, the lives I hadn't touched yet. And then I heard your voice, telling me about your dreams of helping others, even as you were already helping me. Mr. Chen quietly excused himself, leaving the two women alone. Mrs. Chen's expression grew more serious as she reached for a folder that had been sitting on the table beside her. I've been running my foundation for 30 years, she continued, and I've learned to recognize genuine compassion when I see it. That morning, you didn't just save my life, you showed me exactly the kind of person our healthcare system needs. The waitress's heart began to race as Mrs. Chen opened the folder. Inside were brochures for the state's top nursing program, the same ones she'd been longingly poring over for months. But there was something else too, official-looking documents with the Chen Family Foundation letterhead. My dear, Mrs. Chen said softly, her eyes twinkling, I believe everything happens for a reason. That accident could have been the end of my story, but instead, it's going to be the beginning of yours. The waitress stared at the documents in Mrs. Chen's hands, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The afternoon sun streaming through the sunroom windows seemed to illuminate every detail of this moment, the gentle rustling of papers, the lingering scent of jasmine tea, and the knowing smile on Mrs. Chen's face. The Chen Family Foundation would like to offer you a full scholarship to complete your nursing degree, Mrs. Chen explained, her voice gentle but firm. This includes tuition, books, living expenses, and even a small stipend so you won't have to work such long hours at the diner. All we ask in return is that you commit to working in community healthcare for at least 2 years after graduation. The waitress felt the room spin slightly. She gripped the arms of her chair, trying to ground herself in reality. But, why me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. There must be hundreds of more qualified candidates. Mrs. Chen reached across and placed her hand over the waitress's trembling one. My dear, in all my years running this foundation, I've learned that qualifications on paper tell only half the story. That morning, trapped under that car, I saw something in you that can't be taught in any classroom, genuine compassion and quick thinking under pressure. Those are qualities every great nurse needs. Tears began rolling down the waitress's cheeks as the reality of the moment sank in. Her mind flashed to all those late nights studying borrowed textbooks, the carefully hidden nursing school brochures under her bed, and the tip money she'd been saving in an old coffee tin, barely enough for 1 semester's worth of books. Mr. Chen returned with a fresh pot of tea and some documents that needed signing. As he explained the scholarship details, the waitress learned that the foundation would also provide mentoring support and help secure her clinical placements at the best hospitals in the area. It seemed too good to be true, yet here it was, printed in black and white before her. There's one more thing, Mrs. Chen added, exchanging a meaningful look with her son. The morning of the accident, I was actually on my way to meet with the hospital board. You see, our foundation is starting a new program focused on emergency response training for healthcare workers. We'd like you to be part of the first cohort. Your experience that morning showed us exactly why this training is so crucial. The waitress listened, amazed at how life could change so dramatically in less than a week. Just days ago, she'd been worried about making rent and stretching her tips to cover basic expenses. Now, she was sitting in a beautiful sunroom, being offered not just an education, but a chance to be part of something bigger than herself. As the afternoon wore on, they discussed practical details, when she could start classes, which apartment complex near the nursing school she might like to live in, and how the Foundation would help ease her transition from full-time work to full-time study. With each detail that fell into place, the reality of this new chapter in her life became clearer. Before she left, Mrs. Chen asked to have a moment alone with her. "You know," the elderly woman said softly, "when I started this foundation, I hoped to change lives. I never imagined that nearly losing my own would lead me to someone like you. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from our darkest moments." The waitress hugged Mrs. Chen carefully, mindful of her injuries, but wanting to convey all the gratitude she couldn't put into words. As she walked back to the bus stop that evening, her bag heavy with documents and her heart full of dreams finally within reach, she realized that her act of courage hadn't just saved a life, it had transformed her own in ways she never could have imagined. The news spread quickly through the small diner where she worked. Her manager, a tough but fair woman who'd given her extra shifts when rent was due, pulled her into a tight hug with tears in her eyes. Regular customers who'd watched her studying medical textbooks during slow periods stopped by specifically to congratulate her. Even the grumpy morning cook cracked a smile and made her favorite omelette on the house. But reality truly hit home when she received her acceptance letter from the nursing school. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope in her tiny apartment, the paper feeling both delicate and weighty with possibility. The words, "We are pleased to inform you," brought fresh tears to her eyes, tears of joy, relief, and a touch of fear at the massive change ahead. The following weeks became a whirlwind of preparation. The Chen Foundation support team helped her find a modest but comfortable apartment near campus, arranged for her early release from her current lease without penalty, and even connected her with a former scholarship recipient who'd become a successful nurse practitioner. Every detail was handled with care, but the foundation made sure she remained involved in all decisions, teaching her valuable lessons about managing her new circumstances. One evening, as she packed up her belongings, she came across the coffee tin where she'd been saving for nursing school. Inside were hundreds of dollar bills and coins, carefully collected over years of double shifts and foregone luxuries. She sat on her bed, holding the tin, remembering all the times she'd dropped tips inside while wondering if she'd ever save enough. Now, she had a different decision to make about these funds. The next day, she visited Mrs. Chen, who was recovering remarkably well and had begun taking short walks in her garden. The waitress presented her with an envelope containing all her savings. "I want to donate this to the foundation," she explained, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "It's not much, but maybe it can help someone else who's dreaming of becoming a nurse." Mrs. Chen's eyes welled with tears as she listened to the young woman's explanation. Instead of accepting the money, she proposed something different. "Why don't we use this as seed money for a new initiative? You can help us design a program to support other service industry workers who dream of entering healthcare. Your perspective would be invaluable." The idea took root, and soon the waitress found herself in meetings with the foundation's team, sharing her experiences and helping develop criteria for a new scholarship program. Her former life as a waitress wasn't something to leave behind, it was becoming a bridge to help others cross the same gap she had. As her last day at the diner approached, her coworkers organized a surprise farewell party. They decorated the counter with streamers, and customers throughout the day left her cards and small gifts. One elderly couple who'd been coming in for breakfast every Sunday for years handed her a brand new stethoscope. "We've watched you study for so long," they said. "We knew you'd make it someday." That night, after her final shift, she stood outside the diner in her uniform for the last time. The neon sign buzzed softly overhead, and through the windows, she could see the familiar scene of the night shift getting underway. A wave of emotion washed over her, not just gratitude for where she was going, but deep appreciation for where she'd been. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Remember, dear one, you're not just starting nursing school. You're continuing your journey of helping others, just with different tools. The compassion you showed that morning under the car? That's what will make you an extraordinary nurse. The first day of nursing school arrived with the same nervous energy she used to feel before a busy breakfast shift. Standing in front of the mirror in her new apartment, she smoothed down her crisp white uniform, so different from the diner's casual attire. The strategic placement of furniture from her old apartment helped make this new space feel like home, though the view of the campus through her window still felt surreal. Her years of managing hectic breakfast rushes hadn't prepared her for the intensity of nursing school. The lectures were demanding, the medical terminology felt like learning a new language, and the anatomy labs required a level of focus she'd never experienced before. Yet, something unexpected happened during her first practical session. Her waitressing skills proved surprisingly valuable. While other students fumbled with bed-making techniques and patient positioning, her years of balancing heavy trays and maneuvering through tight spaces gave her a natural advantage. Her instructor noticed how she instinctively positioned herself to support patients' weight, just as she'd once helped elderly customers into their seats at the diner. During patient communication classes, she found herself drawing on experiences from her waitressing days. The way she'd handled rushed businesspeople, grumpy morning customers, and anxious late-night diners had taught her more about human nature than any textbook could. Her classmates began asking for tips on how she managed to put even the most nervous practice patients at ease. One afternoon, while studying in the library, she received an unexpected visit from Mr. Chen. He brought news that their new scholarship initiative, the one started with her savings, had received its first round of applications. "Mom insisted on having you review them with us," he explained. "She says your perspective is crucial since you've lived their experiences." That weekend, she sat in Mrs. Chen's sunroom, now fully recovered and bustling with energy, reviewing applications from other service industry workers dreaming of healthcare careers. Reading their stories, a bartender who'd performed CPR on a customer, a hotel housekeeper who'd helped a guest through a panic attack, she saw reflections of her own journey in each one. "You see," Mrs. Chen said, noting her emotional reaction to the applications, "sometimes the best healthcare workers come from unexpected places. They bring something special, a deep understanding of people that can't be taught in any classroom." The reality of Mrs. Chen's words became clear during her first clinical rotation. While some of her classmates excelled at the technical aspects but struggled with patient interaction, she found herself naturally attuned to the small details that made patients comfortable. She noticed when they were too polite to mention their discomfort, just as she'd once known which customers needed extra attention at the diner. One particularly challenging day, she encountered a patient who reminded her of her regular customers, an elderly man who masked his fear with gruffness. Drawing on her diner experience, she knew exactly how to approach him. By the end of her shift, he was sharing stories about his grandchildren, and her clinical instructor praised her patient care skills. That evening, as she walked back to her apartment through the campus, she called Mrs. Chen to share her experience. "You know," Mrs. Chen said warmly, "when I was trapped under that car, it wasn't just your strength that saved me. It was your instinct to keep talking, to keep me calm. You were already a caregiver then, now you're just learning the medicine to go with it." Her former diner manager had framed her last name tag, writing beneath it, "From serving coffee to saving lives." She hung it in her study area as a reminder of where she'd come from. Every time the coursework felt overwhelming or the clinical rotations exhausted her, that name tag reminded her that she'd already proven her strength, not just in lifting a car, but in pursuing her dreams one small step at a time. As the seasons changed and her first year of nursing school progressed, she found herself becoming part of something larger than she'd ever imagined. The Chen Foundation's new initiative, born from her coffee tin savings, had grown beyond their initial expectations. What started as a small scholarship program had blossomed into a full support network for service workers transitioning into healthcare careers. During one of her regular visits to Mrs. Chen, she learned that their story had inspired other foundations to create similar programs. "You see," Mrs. Chen explained, serving tea in the same sunroom where everything had changed months ago, sometimes it takes one story to help people see possibilities they never considered before. Her own story had spread through the nursing school, though not in the way she'd expected. Rather than being known as the waitress who rescued someone, she became known for her unique approach to patient care. During simulation exercises, other students would watch how she incorporated her service industry experience into medical scenarios. Her technique for calming anxious patients, learned from years of handling stressed customers, became so effective that instructors began using it as an example. One rainy afternoon, while practicing patient assessments in the simulation lab, she encountered a scenario that brought her journey full circle. The mock patient was an elderly woman who'd been in a car accident. As she went through the assessment, she found herself fighting back tears, remembering that fateful morning. Her instructor, noticing her emotion, pulled her aside afterward. "That wasn't just textbook perfect care," the instructor said, "that was genuine empathy. You weren't just going through the motions, you were connecting with the patient's experience." The instructor then asked her to share her story with the incoming class of nursing students, believing it could help them understand the deeper meaning of patient care. Standing before the class of new students, she felt a familiar nervousness, similar to her first day of waiting tables. But as she began speaking about her journey, from the diner to the accident scene, from Mrs. Chen's scholarship to her current studies, she saw understanding dawn in their eyes. Many of them had their own stories of unexpected paths to nursing, and her experience gave them permission to see their diverse backgrounds as strengths rather than limitations. The Chen Foundation's quarterly meeting brought another surprise. They'd received a grant to develop a formal mentorship program, pairing experienced healthcare workers with service industry professionals interested in medical careers. Without hesitation, she volunteered to be one of the first mentors, even while still completing her own studies. "But I'm still learning myself," she protested when Mrs. Chen insisted she was perfect for the role. The elderly woman simply smiled and replied, "My dear, the best guides are often those who can still remember clearly what it's like to begin the journey." Her first mentee was a young barista working through prerequisites for nursing school. Together, they would meet at the same diner where she used to work, going over anatomy flashcards between coffee refills. The current waitstaff would smile knowingly, seeing themselves in this familiar scene of dreams taking shape over coffee-stained textbooks. One evening, as she walked home from a particularly challenging clinical rotation, she passed the spot where she'd found Mrs. Chen trapped under the car. The town had installed a new streetlight there, making the area brighter and safer. She paused for a moment, remembering the strength she didn't know she had that morning, the voice inside that told her she could lift a car to save a stranger's life. That same inner voice now guided her through complicated medical procedures and difficult patient interactions. It reminded her that every skill she'd gained, from memorizing complex breakfast orders to balancing multiple tables' needs, had prepared her for this new chapter in ways she never could have predicted. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mentee asking about an upcoming anatomy test, and she smiled, knowing that the circle of support that began with her was already expanding to embrace others with similar dreams. As her final semester of nursing school approached, the impact of that life-changing morning continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the Chen Foundation Service Worker to Healthcare program, now nicknamed the Coffee Tin Scholarship by its recipients. The article included pictures of current scholars, a former cab driver studying to become a paramedic, a hotel concierge pursuing physical therapy, and a food delivery worker on track to become a medical technician. During her advanced clinical rotations, she found herself assigned to the very emergency department where she'd accompanied Mrs. Chen after the accident. The same nurses who'd treated Mrs. Chen that morning were now her mentors, though they insisted they were learning as much from her as she was from them. Her unique background gave her insights into patient care that traditional training alone couldn't provide. One particularly busy night shift, an ambulance brought in an accident victim, a young waitress who'd been hit by a car while walking home from work. As she helped stabilize the patient, she felt a profound connection to her own past. The girl's worn sneakers and food service uniform told a familiar story. Between treatments, she held the scared young woman's hand and shared her own journey, watching hope replace fear in the patient's eyes. The next day, she visited Mrs. Chen, still energetic despite the passing years, to share the experience. "You know," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, arranging fresh flowers in her sunroom. "That morning when fate brought us together, we didn't just change two lives. We created a template for transformation." She was right. The program had already helped dozens of service workers transition into healthcare careers, but its influence extended beyond just providing scholarships. It had sparked conversations about the value of life experience in medical care, leading several hospitals to actively recruit employees with service industry backgrounds for their patient care teams. Her own story became part of the nursing school's curriculum, not just as an inspirational tale, but as a case study in the importance of diverse life experiences in healthcare. During a guest lecture she gave to first-year students, a professor pointed out how her quick thinking during Mrs. Chen's rescue demonstrated the same split-second decision-making skills crucial for emergency nursing. As graduation neared, she received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national healthcare conference about alternative pathways into medical careers. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of healthcare professionals, she felt the weight of representing not just herself, but every person who'd ever dreamed of more while refilling coffee cups or serving meals. "Sometimes," she told the audience, her voice steady and clear, "our most important qualifications don't come from textbooks. They come from learning to read people's needs, from staying calm under pressure, from finding strength we didn't know we had. Every coffee stain on my old apron taught me something about patient care." The conference speech caught the attention of several hospital administrators, leading to job offers and opportunities she'd never imagined possible. But what touched her most was the line of service workers who approached her afterward, each carrying their own dreams of transitioning into healthcare. That evening, back in her apartment, she found a package from Mrs. Chen. Inside was a delicate silver pendant shaped like a coffee cup transforming into a medical cross. The note read, "To remind you that every path to healing is unique, and that sometimes the strongest medicines are kindness, understanding, and the courage to change someone's life, even if that someone is yourself." As she prepared for her licensing exam, studying late into the night, she often touched that pendant. It reminded her of everything that had brought her to this point: the weight of a car on her shoulders, the countless cups of coffee served, the trust of patients in her care, and most importantly, the belief that one act of courage could transform not just a life, but an entire community. 3 years after that fateful morning, she stood in her crisp nursing uniform before a new class of Chen Foundation scholars. The Foundation's headquarters had grown to include a dedicated training center, where former service workers could attend pre-nursing courses while still maintaining their regular jobs. The wall behind her displayed dozens of photos: waitresses turned nurses, bartenders become paramedics, hotel staff transformed into physical therapists, each face telling its own story of transformation. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her eyes bright with pride. Though older now, she remained the heart of the foundation, attending every orientation to personally welcome new scholars. The accident that could have ended her life had instead created a legacy that would continue changing lives for generations to come. "When I lifted that car," she began her speech to the eager faces before her, "I wasn't thinking about changing my life or starting a movement. I was just doing what anyone would do, helping someone in need. But that's the thing about acts of kindness, they have a way of coming back to you in ways you never expect." She shared how her experience serving others in the diner had prepared her for serving patients in the hospital, how managing difficult customers had taught her to handle challenging medical situations, and how the discipline of early morning shifts had readied her for the demands of emergency room rotations. As she spoke, she noticed a young woman in a familiar diner uniform sitting in the back row, taking careful notes. It was the same waitress she'd treated in the emergency room after the car accident a year ago. Now, she was part of the newest cohort of scholars, her own journey of transformation just beginning. The program had evolved beyond their initial vision. The foundation now partnered with hospitals across the country, creating specialized internship programs that valued service industry experience. Their graduates had some of the highest patient satisfaction rates in their facilities, their years of customer service translating into exceptional bedside manner. After the orientation, Mrs. Chen pulled her aside with exciting news. The State Board of Nursing had approached them about developing a standardized program to help service industry workers transition into healthcare careers. They wanted her to lead the initiative, combining her unique perspective as both a former waitress and now an experienced nurse. "You see," Mrs. Chen said, squeezing her hand, "that morning under the car, we both thought we were at our weakest moment. Instead, it was just the beginning of our strength. Every person you've helped, every life you've touched, they're all part of that same moment of courage." Later that evening, she made a special visit to her old diner. The place hadn't changed much, same neon sign, same coffee smell, same steady stream of customers. But now, thanks to a partnership with the foundation, there was a small bulletin board near the entrance titled "Dreams in Progress," featuring information about healthcare career pathways and success stories of former service workers. As she sipped coffee at her old counter spot, she watched the current wait staff moving efficiently between tables. Each one of them, she realized, had the potential to become something more, not because their current work wasn't valuable, but because every experience, every interaction, every challenge was preparing them for possibilities they might not yet imagine. Her pager buzzed, the emergency room needed her back early. As she left a generous tip and headed out, she paused at the spot where the diner's front window offered a clear view of the intersection where it all began. The morning sun caught the silver pendant around her neck, the coffee cup transforming into a medical cross glinting in the light. In that moment, she understood that her story wasn't just about one person lifting a car to save another. It was about the extraordinary power of ordinary people to lift each other up, to transform limitations into possibilities, and to prove that sometimes the longest journeys begin with a single act of courage, and maybe a cup of coffee.